My parents called my scholarship a waste, then the dean called them personally. My name is Rachel Bishop, and I am 34 years old. I run the donor relations office for a children's hospital foundation in Portland, and most days my biggest problem is convincing a retired dentist to increase his pledge by $10,000. But 3 weeks ago, I was standing in my mother's garage, holding a manila folder I had never seen before, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to set it down on top of a box marked Christmas ornaments before I could open it. My grandmother had just died. We were clearing out the house so it could go on the market, and my mother had asked me, not my brother, not my sister, me, to sort through the old filing cabinet in the garage, because, she said, you're the organized one. I found the folder in the second drawer, behind a stack of expired coupons and a manual for a dishwasher we hadn't owned since 2004. It was labeled, in my mother's handwriting, with a single word, Rachel. Inside were 7 letters from the Dean of Financial Aid at Ashford University, dated across 4 months in the spring of my senior year of high school. I had never seen a single one of them. And by the time I finished reading the last letter, I understood something that had taken me 17 years to understand. My parents had not simply been disappointed when I won a full scholarship to college. They had been afraid. This is the story of how I found out what they'd done, and what I did after I found out. It didn't happen the way you'd expect. There was no screaming. I never once raised my voice. But by the end of it, my family would never be the same again, and for the first time in my life, I would be at peace with that. Before I keep going, let me say a quick hello. If you're new here, welcome. I tell true stories about family, money, and the quiet moments when people show you who they really are. If you've been here before, thank you for coming back. I read every comment, even the long ones, especially the long ones, so if this story reminds you of something in your own life, I'd love to hear it. And if you want to hear how it ends, go ahead and subscribe now, because this one has a lot of turns. Okay. Let me take you back to where it started. The house on Larkspur Street. I grew up in a beige split level on Larkspur Street in Hillsboro, Oregon, in a neighborhood where every lawn was mowed on Saturday morning and every family, from the outside, looked exactly like ours, stable, respectable, unremarkable. My father, Gordon Bishop, was a mechanical engineer at a company that made parts for irrigation systems. He wore the same 5 shirts on rotation, believed strongly in punctuality, and measured a person's worth by how hard they worked and how little they complained about it. He was not a cruel man. He was a proud one, which is a different thing, though it can look the same from certain angles. My mother, Diane Bishop, sold real estate part-time and ran our household like a business with a single, permanent client, appearances. She kept the good china behind glass. She ironed pillowcases. She had a way of saying we don't air our laundry that made it clear laundry existed, and there was quite a lot of it, and none of it would ever see daylight. I was the middle child. My older brother, Kyle, was 4 years ahead of me, and from the time I could form memories, he was the son our family orbited. He was funny and easy and good at football, and when he brought home a C, my father would say, well, he's not a book kid, that's fine, some men build things with their hands. When I brought home a C, which happened exactly once, in 8th grade algebra, my father sat across from me at the kitchen table for 40 minutes explaining, without raising his voice, exactly how a C in 8th grade would follow me for the rest of my life. My younger sister, Emma, was born when I was 5, and by the time she was old enough to have a personality, The family had already decided what her personality was. She was the sensitive one, the artistic one, the one who needed to be handled gently. Nobody ever needed to handle me gently. I don't think it occurred to anyone that I needed handling at all. My grandmother, Vivian Hartley, my mother's mother, was the only person in my childhood who looked at me like I was already whole. She had grown up poor in Eastern Oregon, married well, been widowed early, and built a small but real fortune out of rental properties. She managed herself well into her 70s. She did not believe in giving people things. She believed in giving people leverage. You don't need anybody to hand you anything, Rachel N., she told me once, when I was maybe 9, sitting on her porch shelling peas. You need somebody to get out of your way. I didn't understand yet how much of my life would be spent waiting for exactly that. My grandfather, Walter Hartley, had died before I was born. I knew him only through photographs and through my grandmother's stories, and through one other thing, a modest trust he'd set up before his death, meant to be split among his grandchildren for their education. I didn't know the details. I only knew vaguely, the way children know things adults discuss in lowered voices, that there was money somewhere with my name loosely attached to it, and that my parents were the ones who managed it until I turned 18. I want to be clear about something before I go further. This is not a story about villains. My father genuinely believed, for most of my life, that he was protecting our family. My mother genuinely believed that keeping up appearances was the same thing as keeping us safe. Even the parts of this story that hurt the most were, from the other side of the table, acts that someone had convinced themselves were reasonable. That's what made them so hard to see coming. The ledger nobody showed me. By the time I was in high school, our family's finances had quietly become a house of cards, though I wouldn't understand that until much later. My father's job was stable but not lucrative. He made about $72,000 a year in the early 2000s, decent for Hillsborough but not enough to explain the pool my parents put in when I was 12, or the boat, or the 2 family trips to Hawaii. What explained it, though I didn't know this yet, was that my parents had been quietly drawing against a home equity line of credit for a decade, and refinancing whenever the payments got tight. Kyle graduated high school with mediocre grades and no clear plan, and my parents did what they always did when Kyle needed something: they found a way. He enrolled in a 2-year business program at a community college, dropped out after 3 semesters, and by 22 had convinced my father to co-sign a loan for a food truck business, Bishop's Burgers. That lasted 14 months before folding under a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices. I remember the night my father found out how bad it really was. I was 15. I was doing homework at the kitchen table, technically not eavesdropping, though the kitchen and the living room in our house shared a wall thin enough that eavesdropping required no effort at all. He owes $11,000 to the commissary kitchen alone, my father said, his voice low and tight. 11,000, Diane. He's 22. He made a mistake. This isn't a mistake, this is a pattern. This is the 3rd time. Don't you dare say that like it's his fault. He's trying. Not everybody gets things handed to them the way. I didn't hear the end of that sentence, because my mother lowered her voice, but I heard enough. Not everybody gets things handed to them was a phrase I would hear, in one form or another, for the next 19 years, always in defense of Kyle, always with an unspoken comparison sitting just beneath it. The comparison, I eventually understood, was me. I got straight A's that semester, made varsity tennis, and started tutoring younger kids on weekends for spending money, because I had figured out early that if I needed something in that house, I would need to be the one who provided it. Nobody threw me a party for the A's. Kyle's food truck failure got a family meeting, a loan restructuring, and, I would learn 17 years later, $8,000 quietly pulled from an account that was never supposed to touch him at all. Emma and the weight of being fine. My sister Emma was 10 that year, and she'd started drawing constantly, on napkins, in the margins of her homework, on the walls of her closet in a spot she thought nobody would find. She was good, genuinely good, in the way that makes adults uncomfortable because they don't know what to do with a talented child who isn't performing a talent adults recognize, like sports or piano. My mother called it Emma's little hobby. My father called it, not unkindly, a phase, the way he called most things that didn't fit into his idea of a productive life a phase. I was the one who bought Emma her first real set of colored pencils, with tutoring money, for her 11th birthday. She still has them. She told me that, years later, in a conversation that mattered more than either of us expected it to at the time. "You were the only one who ever asked what I was drawing," she said. "Not just looked at it and said, 'That's nice, sweetie.' You'd ask why the sky was purple. You'd ask who the little dog was." I didn't think anything of it back then. I just liked my sister, and I liked the quiet, careful way she saw the world, so different from the loud, appearance-driven way our parents saw it. I didn't realize I was building something with her, a small, private trust, that would matter enormously 15 years later. What I remember most about being 16 is a specific kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of being the child nobody worried about. Kyle got worried about constantly, because he kept giving people reasons to worry. Emma got worried about because she was young and sensitive. I got left alone, which felt, at the time, like a kind of freedom, and which I would only later understand as a kind of neglect wearing freedom's clothes. The envelope from Ashford. In October of my senior year, I got a thick envelope in the mail from Ashford University, a well-regarded liberal arts college 6 hours away in eastern Washington, with a strong pre-med track and, more importantly to 17-year-old me, a campus I'd visited on a school trip that had made me feel, for the first time, like I could imagine a whole different life. I hadn't told my parents I'd applied there. I'd applied to 4 in-state schools they knew about, and Ashford quietly, on my own, paying the application fee with tutoring money, because some instinct told me not to mention it until there was something to mention. The envelope contained an offer of admission and something called the Hartley Legacy Scholars Award, full tuition, room, and board, renewable for 4 years, contingent on maintaining a 3.5 GPA. I read the name twice before it landed, Hartley. My grandmother's maiden name. My grandfather's name. Ashford, it turned out, was Walter Hartley's alma mater, and decades earlier he'd made a modest gift that eventually grew, through the university's endowment, into a named merit scholarship, one that, as it happened, I had won entirely on my own, without anyone in my family pulling a single string, because the committee didn't cross-reference last names against old donor rolls unless you told them to. I didn't know any of that history yet. I just knew I'd gotten a full ride to a school 6 hours from home, and I sat on my bed with the letter shaking slightly in my hands, feeling something I can only describe as the floor of my life tilting open beneath me. I brought the letter downstairs that night at dinner. I remember exactly how the kitchen smelled, pork chops, my mother's rosemary potatoes, and exactly where everyone was sitting, because I would replay this scene in my head for the next 17 years. I got in, I said. Full ride. Tuition, room, board, everything. I slid the letter across the table toward my father. He read it slowly. My mother read it over his shoulder. Kyle, 21 that year and living back at home after the food truck collapsed, didn't look up from his phone. Ashford, my father said finally, like the word tasted strange. That's not even a school we talked about. I applied on my own. I didn't want to bring it up until I knew. It's 6 hours away, my mother said. That's the point, Mom. She set the letter down on the table, and I watched her face do the thing it did when she'd already decided something and was only working out how to say it in a way that sounded reasonable. Rachel, honey, we love that you're excited. But this is a big decision, and we're not going to make it over pork chops. It's not really a decision, though. It's fully paid. I could go to state and we'd still be paying for housing and books, and it's free, Mom. It's completely free. Nothing is completely free, my father said, and something in his voice had gone flat and final in a way I recognized and had learned, over 17 years, to be careful around. There's an opportunity cost to everything. You'd be 6 hours from your family. From your support system. For a school that, frankly, none of us have ever heard of. It's ranked. I'm not talking about a magazine ranking, he said. I'm talking about what it means to walk away from your family to go somewhere nobody knows you, for a degree that isn't going to get you anywhere state wouldn't. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I've replayed it so many times I could recite it like a script. My mother reached over and put her hand on top of mine on the table, the letter still lying between us, and she said the sentence that would live in me for the next 17 years, the sentence I would eventually build an entire different life around refusing to hear again. We just think this scholarship is going to end up being a waste, sweetheart. You'll get there, you'll be homesick, you'll transfer back within a year, and then what was the point of all that upheaval? Stay close. Go to state. Save everyone the heartache. A waste. Not the school. Not the distance. The scholarship itself, the thing I had earned entirely on my own, quietly, without a single dollar or ounce of help from anyone at that table, reduced, in one sentence, to something that would end up being a waste. I didn't argue that night. I was 17, and arguing with my parents, in our house, was a losing game I'd learned not to play by age 9. I picked the letter back up, folded it along its original creases, and went upstairs. What I didn't know, sitting on my bed that night with the letter in my lap, was that my parents' objection had almost nothing to do with distance, or homesickness, or my well-being. It had to do with a spreadsheet in a drawer in my father's home office that I would not see for 17 more years. Kyle's third chance. 6 weeks after I got my acceptance letter, Kyle came to my parents with a new plan. He'd met a guy from his old community college program who wanted to open a legitimate restaurant, not a food truck this time, an actual sit-down restaurant, a burger place with a full liquor license, in a strip mall off Highway 26. Kyle needed $40,000 for his half of the buy-in. I know the exact number because I would eventually see the wire transfer record myself, 17 years later, sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table with a lawyer on speakerphone. But at 17, all I knew was what filtered through the thin wall between the kitchen and the living room. We don't have $40,000 sitting around, Gordon. We have the equity line. We just refinanced that in the spring. There's room. And there's Walter's trust. That's not ours to touch. That's the kids' education money. It's not touched until they're 18, and even then it's discretionary until they're 25, you know that. Your mother set it up that way specifically so it wouldn't just get handed over. Gordon. I'm not saying we drain it. I'm saying there's flexibility in how it's invested, and if we move some of it into something that generates a return instead of sitting in a money market account earning nothing. I didn't understand, at 17, what I was hearing. I understood it, entirely, 17 years later, when I read the actual trust documents and the actual account statements and saw, in black and white, exactly what flexibility in how it's invested had turned out to mean. $8,000 from Kyle's failed food truck, and then, that November, $31,000 more, moved out of an account with my name and my sister's name jointly attached to it, and into Kyle's new restaurant, disguised on my father's handwritten ledger, the one I would find in the garage folder, as a family business loan, to be repaid. It was never repaid. The restaurant lasted 19 months. I didn't know any of this at 17. I only knew that a week after I heard that conversation through the wall, my father sat me down and told me that after really thinking it over as a family, they'd decided the Ashford scholarship wasn't the right fit, and that he'd already spoken to an admissions counselor at Oregon State about a late decision spot for me in the fall. You never even asked me, I said. We're asking you now. What do you think? It wasn't a question. It had never been a question. But I said yes, because I was 17, and because saying no in that house had a cost I wasn't yet brave enough to pay. I called Ashford's financial aid office the next week, from the payphone outside my school because I didn't want the call showing up on our home phone bill, and asked if I could defer my enrollment by 1 year. I got a very kind woman named Margaret Whitfield, the Dean of Financial Aid, who told me deferrals were possible under certain circumstances, and asked, gently, if everything was all right at home. Everything's fine, I told her. I just need a little more time. I didn't know it yet, but Dean Whitfield wrote my name down in a file that day, and she would not forget it. The year of waiting. I spent what should have been my freshman year of college living at home, taking 2 classes at the community college, and working 25 hours a week at a pharmacy, telling myself it was temporary. I watched Kyle's new restaurant open with a ribbon cutting my parents attended like it was a wedding. I watched my mother tell her book club, unprompted, that Kyle was finally finding his footing. I watched Emma, 13 now, retreat further into her sketchbooks, quieter every month, and I didn't yet have the language to understand that she was becoming quiet the way a house becomes quiet when the people in it have learned that being loud doesn't get you heard, only noticed, and being noticed in our family was not always safe. I called Dean Whitfield's office again in March, right around the anniversary of my original acceptance, mostly to ask a logistics question about the deferral paperwork. She remembered my name before I finished saying it. Rachel Bishop. The Hartley Scholar. I was hoping you'd call. Something about the way she said it, like I was a person she'd been keeping a small light on for, undid something in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. I need to ask about extending the deferral, I said. Family stuff came up. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause I'd learned years later, meant someone was deciding how far to push a question. Rachel, I don't need details if you don't want to share them. But I want you to know the offer stands, and if there's ever anything the financial aid office can help clarify, for you or for your parents, my door is open. Some families need a little extra information to feel comfortable with how these funds work. I didn't understand, at 18, what she was really offering me. I thought she meant brochures. What she actually meant, I'd learn much later, was that scholarship offices sometimes see the same story more than once: a promising student, a sudden family objection, a scholarship abruptly framed as impractical. And that experienced deans develop a quiet, careful instinct for when a family decision isn't really about the student at all. I enrolled at Ashford that fall, 1 year late, $20,000 of voluntary contribution requirement hanging over my head that the scholarship committee had added when they restructured my award after the deferral. A detail buried in fine print that my father, when I finally showed him the paperwork, brushed past without reading closely, too relieved, I think, that I was finally leaving the house quietly instead of loudly. I didn't know yet that the voluntary contribution requirement was tied, indirectly, to the very same custodial trust my father had already started drawing from. I wouldn't understand that connection for 17 more years. But Dean Whitfield understood it immediately, the day the paperwork crossed her desk. And she started, quietly, keeping a file. Escalation. Move-in day. I arrived at Ashford in August with 2 suitcases, a laptop I'd bought with pharmacy money, and a hollow feeling in my chest that I told myself was just nerves. My parents didn't come. It was a 6-hour drive, my father said, and gas was expensive, and honestly, Rachel, you're 19 now, you don't need us fussing over a dorm room. My grandmother drove me instead. 6 hours in her old Buick, radio tuned to a country station she didn't even like, because she said the silence otherwise would make her fall asleep at the wheel. Somewhere around hour 4, she said, without looking away from the road, your father tell you why they didn't want you coming here? Distance. Homesickness. The usual. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, you know this school's named after your grandfather's gift, don't you? Not named after him exactly. But that scholarship you got, that program's got Hartley money sitting behind it, going back 30 years. I hadn't known that, not really, not consciously. I thought I won it on my own. You did win it on your own, she said sharply. Nobody pulled a string for you, don't you dare think otherwise. I'm just telling you where the roots are. Your grandfather believed the smartest thing a person could do with money was make sure it outlived them doing some good. Your father's never much understood that instinct. She glanced at me. You remember that, when things get hard up there. You didn't take a handout. You grew into something that was already planted. I didn't fully understand what she meant until years later. At the time, I just held on to the sentence like a stone in my pocket, something solid to touch when things got difficult. They got difficult almost immediately. The calls that kept coming. My mother called every Sunday, without fail, for the first 2 months. The calls always followed the same shape: pleasantries, a question about my classes she didn't really want the answer to, and then, eventually, news about home that was never quite news, always a soft, circling request. Kyle's been so stressed with the restaurant. Your father had to help him cover payroll again this month. Emma's struggling in math. I don't suppose you could look over her homework next time you're home? Your dad's back has been bothering him. He probably shouldn't be doing so much overtime, but you know how he is. I noticed, slowly, that every call ended the same way, a gentle, almost offhand comment about how nice it would be if I were closer. How things were harder without me. How Kyle and Emma really could use a big sister around. By October, the calls started including numbers. Not always directly, my mother was too careful for that, but numbers all the same. We're a little tight this month, with the restaurant expansion. You wouldn't happen to have any of that scholarship stipend left over, would you? Just to tide us over till Kyle's next distribution comes in. I did have some of it. Ashford's award included a small living stipend, meant for books and incidentals, $400 a semester. I sent her $200 that October, out of guilt I couldn't fully name, and another $150 in November. It felt, at the time, like keeping the peace. It would take me years to understand it as the first entries in a ledger that would eventually run into the tens of thousands. I met Priya Nair in October, in a shared dorm study lounge, both of us pulling all-nighters for the same organic chemistry midterm. She was blunt, funny, and from a family so different from mine, loud, affectionate, chaotic in a way that somehow left no one feeling unsafe, that being around her felt, for the first time, like being shown a different possible shape a family could take. Your mom calls you every Sunday and it's never just to talk? Priya asked me once, halfway through a study session, after I hung up from one of the calls looking, apparently, like someone had let air out of me. That's not normal, Rachel. That's not what parents calling their kid at college is supposed to feel like. I laughed it off. That's just how my family is. Every family thinks that's just how their family is, she said. Until they meet somebody else's family and realize it isn't. I didn't have a response to that. I just filed it away, the way I filed away most things that unsettled me back then, and kept going. Christmas, sophomore year. I came home for Christmas my sophomore year to a house that looked exactly the same and felt entirely different. Kyle's restaurant had closed in September, quietly, with almost no discussion, the way our family handled all of Kyle's failures, folding them into the background of ordinary life before I even had a chance to ask questions. He was living at home again, in his old room, working part-time at an auto parts store, and my parents had stopped mentioning the restaurant entirely, the way you stop mentioning a scar once it's healed enough not to hurt when you look at it, even if it never actually goes away. Emma, 15 now, had gotten quieter still. She'd started eating dinner in her room some nights, a habit my mother explained away as just a phase, you know how teenagers get, in the same tone she'd once used for Emma's drawing. I found her one night on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, sketchbook on her knees, and I sat down next to her without saying anything for a long while. You okay? I finally asked. She didn't look up from the page. Mom went through my sketchbook again. Found the ones of, she stopped. Never mind. The ones of what, Em? There's a boy. Julian. From my art class. She said it carefully, like handling something breakable. Mom found some drawings of him and made this whole thing out of it, like I was, I don't know, doing something wrong. Just for drawing someone. Are you and Julian? No. We're just friends. He's just easy to draw, he's got this face. It's interesting, she stopped again, closed the sketchbook. It doesn't matter. She took it. Said she'd give it back when I showed better judgment about what I put my energy into. I felt something harden in my chest that night, a small, specific anger on Emma's behalf that I recognized, uncomfortably, as an old anger of my own wearing a different face. I didn't say anything to my mother about it. I didn't yet know how. But I remembered it. I remembered all of it, in fact, filing each incident away in some quiet internal ledger of my own, the way I'd been doing since I was 9 years old, without ever quite admitting to myself why. On my last night home that Christmas, my father asked me, over dessert, how much my scholarship stipend was running that year. Why? I asked. Just curious how the numbers shake out. Your mother mentioned you'd been generous, helping out here and there. He said it lightly, like a compliment. We really do appreciate it, Rachel. It means a lot, you thinking of your family like that. I didn't correct the framing, that it hadn't felt like generosity so much as obligation, that every dollar I'd sent had come with a small, cold weight attached to it that I hadn't fully examined. I just said, "It's fine, Dad. I'm happy to help when I can," because that was the sentence that ended these conversations fastest, and I had already learned, by 20, that ending conversations fast was sometimes the only power I had. Chapter 10, Junior Year, and the First Real Crack. I met Daniel Coleman in the spring of my junior year, in a campus coffee shop where he was grading essays for the education seminar he TA'd. He had kind eyes and a habit of listening like he actually intended to remember what you said, which, after 20 years of being half listened to at my own dinner table, disarmed me completely. Our first real conversation was about, of all things, families. I'd made some offhand joke about my mother's Sunday calls, and Daniel had gone quiet in a way I was starting to recognize as him actually thinking, rather than waiting for his turn to talk. Does she ever call just to hear how you're doing? No agenda? Sometimes, I said, and then, honestly, not really, no. That sounds lonely, he said, simply, without pity, and something in me cracked slightly at being seen that plainly by someone who had no reason to lie to me about it. We started dating that April. I told my parents about him over the summer, carefully, the way I'd learned to introduce anything new into our household gently, with reassurances preloaded, ready to diffuse whatever objection came first. The objection, when it came, was about his major. Education? He's going to be a teacher? My father said. That's a rough way to support a family, Rachel. Teachers don't make anything. I'm not marrying him for his salary, Dad. Nobody's saying that. I'm just saying, practically speaking. We've been dating 3 months. I'm just saying. He held his hands up, the universal gesture of a man who believed he was being reasonable. Somebody's got to think practically in this family. I noticed, that summer, a new pattern in my parents' finances that I couldn't name yet but felt instinctively, the way you feel a draft before you find the open window. My mother mentioned, twice, a family investment opportunity my father was considering, something to do with a rental duplex Kyle wanted to buy and flip. She asked, both times, in her careful, circling way, whether I had any savings built up from my summer research assistantship, just in case the family needed a bit of a bridge. I said no both times. It was the first time I had ever said no to a direct financial request from my mother, and I remember the silence that followed, brief, cold, quickly papered over with a change of subject, as one of the more frightening moments of my early adulthood, disproportionate as that sounds. I had broken a rule I hadn't known was a rule until I broke it. In my family, you did not say no to a stated need, no matter how vague, no matter how unaccountable. I didn't know yet how right I'd been not to give them that money. I would learn, 17 years later, that the duplex flip lost $46,000, and that the difference had come, once again, from the trust. Graduation, and the toast nobody gave. I graduated from Ashford summa cum laude, with a double major in economics and public health, a job offer already in hand from a hospital foundation in Seattle, and Daniel in the audience holding a bouquet of grocery store carnations he'd clearly bought on his TA stipend, which somehow meant more to me than anything expensive could have. My parents came. My grandmother came, driving the 6 hours herself again, though she was 78 that year and I'd worried about her making the trip. Kyle didn't come. He had a work thing, though I'd later learn there was no work thing, only a fresh business idea he was too consumed pitching to my father to bother with a 6-hour drive for his sister's graduation. Emma came, 18 now, having just been accepted to a state art program my parents had reluctantly agreed to fund, on the condition, she told me privately, that she also takes something practical alongside it, like accounting. At the small dinner afterward, my father raised a glass. I remember this vividly, because it is one of exactly 2 toasts my father gave me in my entire life, and said, to Rachel. She always finds a way to land on her feet. That was it. Not we're proud of you. Not any mention of the degree, the honors, the 4 years of a life built almost entirely without their help, occasionally in spite of their interference. She always finds a way to land on her feet, a sentence that managed to complement my resilience while completely erasing the fact that I had needed resilience in the first place because nobody had been there to catch me. My grandmother, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand under the table. She didn't say anything either, not then. But later that night, walking me to my car, she pressed an envelope into my hand. "Don't open it till you're back at your apartment," she said. "And don't tell your mother." Inside, when I finally did open it, was a check for $5,000 and a note in her looping handwriting. "This is not a handout. This is interest on what's already yours. Ask me about your grandfather's trust when you're ready. Love, Grandma V." I didn't ask, not then. I was 22, exhausted, in love, starting a new job in a new city, and the phrase "your grandfather's trust" felt like a door I wasn't ready to open. I put the note in a shoebox and didn't think about it again for a long time. I should have opened that door sooner. But I understand now why I didn't. Some doors, you can only open once you're strong enough to walk through whatever's on the other side. Wedding bills and a very specific kind of silence. Daniel and I married 3 years later, in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Portland that we paid for almost entirely ourselves. Daniel was teaching high school history by then. I'd been promoted to assistant director of donor relations at the hospital foundation, and between us we'd saved carefully for 2 years to afford exactly the wedding we wanted, no more, no less. My parents contributed $3,000 toward the flowers, which they mentioned, at the reception, at every table they visited, in a tone that suggested the flowers alone had been the difference between a real wedding and an embarrassment. Kyle, 30 by then, had started a third business, a specialty coffee subscription service, and gave a best man adjacent toast, since Daniel's own brother lived overseas and couldn't make it, that somehow became almost entirely about his own entrepreneurial journey, with a brief, warm closing line about how happy he was for his little sister. I don't think he meant any harm by it. I don't think Kyle ever meant much harm by anything, exactly. He simply existed, comfortably, in the center of a family that had spent 30 years training everyone else to orbit him. It was at the wedding that I first noticed something odd about my parents' behavior toward my grandmother. Vivian was 81 that year, sharp as ever, seated at the head table beside me, and I noticed my mother hovering near her more than usual, refilling her water glass unprompted, asking twice within an hour whether she'd thought any more about the house, a question my grandmother deflected both times with a brief, unreadable smile. "What house?" I asked my grandmother quietly, during a lull in the toasts. "Your mother thinks I should move into assisted living and let the family help manage things." She said the phrase "help manage things" with a dry weight that told me exactly what she thought of it. "I'm 81, Rachel, not incompetent. I balance my own checkbook better than your father balances his." I laughed, at the time, thinking it was simply my grandmother's characteristic bluntness. I didn't yet understand that it was the opening move in a much longer conversation my parents had already started having without me, a conversation about my grandmother's estate, her rental properties, and the trust she still, quietly and deliberately, controlled every detail of. 6 months after the wedding, my grandmother had a small stroke, fully recovered, thank God, but enough of a scare that my parents began, with increasing frequency, raising the subject of getting her affairs in order. I was 30 by then, living 40 minutes from my parents with Daniel, and I remember my mother calling to update me, her voice pitched in the careful, managerial register she used whenever she was building toward asking for something. "We think it might be time to have a real conversation about Grandma's will," she said. "Just so everyone's protected. Your father thinks it makes sense for him to be listed as executor, given his financial background." "Has Grandma said she wants that?" "We haven't asked her outright yet. We wanted to talk to you first." I should have asked more questions that day. I should have asked why they were discussing the executorship of my grandmother's estate before discussing it with my grandmother. But I was 30, newly married, building a career, and I told myself, the way I'd told myself 100 times before, that this was simply how my family operated, and that it wasn't really my business to interfere. That instinct, "it's not my business to interfere," would cost me, and it would cost Emma even more, over the next 4 years. The hospital room. 6 months after that first kitchen table conversation with my grandmother, before I'd fully decided what to do with what she'd shown me, my father had a heart scare that landed him in St. Vincent's for 3 days. It wasn't a heart attack, the doctors said, but a warning shot, a blocked artery caught early, a stent placed, a stern lecture about diet and stress that my father received the way he received most feedback, nodding along while privately deciding it didn't apply to him. I sat with him one evening while my mother went to get coffee, the hospital room dim and beeping quietly around us, and for a few minutes, stripped of his usual certainty, hooked to monitors in a thin gown, my father seemed smaller than I had ever seen him. "Your mother tells me you've been spending time with your grandmother," he said, not quite looking at me. "Going through papers." My stomach tightened. A little. "She say anything to you? About the trust?" I chose my words carefully, unsure yet what I wanted him to know I knew. "She's been showing me some old account statements. Family history stuff." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling tile above his bed. "I always meant to put it back," he finally said, so quietly I almost missed it. "Every time. I told myself, next quarter, next bonus, next time the rental income evens out. It just kept not being the right time." He looked at me then, and there was something in his face I'd rarely seen, not quite an apology, but the shape one might eventually take. "I don't expect you to understand what it's like, trying to hold a family together on one income while your son keeps needing rescuing. I made choices I'm not proud of. I want you to know I know that, even if I've never said it right." It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was closer to an explanation offered in place of one, the way my father offered most difficult things. But it was more honesty than he had given me in 25 years, and I sat with it, in that dim hospital room, and said only, "Thank you for telling me that," because I didn't yet trust myself to say anything more without saying everything. I didn't confront him that night. He was recovering from a cardiac event, hooked to machines, and even with everything I now knew, some old instinct in me, the instinct of a daughter, not yet fully unlearned, wouldn't let me use that moment as a weapon. I have never regretted that choice. But I remember it clearly as the first time my father came close to telling me the truth on his own, without being caught, and I understood, watching him drift towards sleep that night, that if I waited for him to finish that sentence voluntarily, I might wait forever. What the numbers actually meant. Before Thanksgiving, I spent one more evening with Tom Alvarez, the financial advisor Priya had recommended, going over exactly what a full accounting would look like, not to build a legal case, but so that when I sat down with my family, I would be speaking from total, unshakable clarity rather than heard alone. Tom walked me through it patiently, spreading printouts across his conference table. Your original trust balance, with conservative growth assumptions from 1994 forward, should have been sitting around $31,000 by the time you turned 25, he said. Factoring in what was actually withdrawn and never repaid, plus the growth that money would have generated had it stayed invested, you're looking at a real shortfall closer to $24,000 principal, and something like $38,000 if you count the lost growth over 2 decades. That's a lot more than I expected, I admitted. It usually is, once you actually run the numbers instead of estimating, Tom said. Money that disappears quietly rarely feels like much in the moment. It's only years later, doing the math properly, that people understand what compounding actually cost them. He looked up at me. For what it's worth, I see this more than you'd think. Families rarely think of it as theft. They think of it as borrowing from tomorrow to fix today, and they genuinely believe tomorrow will take care of itself. It almost never does. That conversation gave me something I hadn't fully had before, not just the emotional weight of what had happened, but the precise, sober shape of it, in dollars and years, which made it easier, when Thanksgiving came, to speak about it calmly rather than only from hurt. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the numbers to simply be true, out loud, in front of the people who had spent 17 years insisting they weren't. Midpoint CTA. If this story is hitting close to home for you, if you've ever had a family that made you feel like your success was somehow a problem to be managed, I want you to know you're not imagining it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because what my parents did next is the reason I finally opened that shoebox my grandmother gave me at my college graduation. Let's keep going. The baby, the bills, and the first real lie I caught. Sophie was born the year I turned 32, a fierce, colicky, wonderful baby who made both Daniel and me feel, for the first time, like the family we'd been quietly building for a decade was actually, permanently real. My parents were thrilled about Sophie, in the specific way they were thrilled about anything that could be photographed and shown to their friends. My mother visited constantly those first few months, which I appreciated, genuinely, until I noticed a pattern. Every visit ended with some variation of a financial ask, framed always as help she was offering, never help she was requesting. I could take Sophie for the weekend so you two can have a break. Actually, while I'm here, your father's been having some cash flow trouble with the rental property he and Kyle are managing. Nothing serious. Just wondered if you and Daniel had anything sitting in savings you weren't using. I said no. I'd been saying no for a few years by then, more easily each time, though it never stopped costing me something internally, a small, familiar flare of guilt that I'd learned to recognize as manufactured rather than earned, but which still, stubbornly, showed up on schedule every time. It was around Sophie's first birthday that I caught the first lie I could actually prove. My mother had mentioned, offhand, that Kyle and his wife Melissa were finally getting back on their feet, having moved into a nicer rental in Beaverton after Kyle landed a stable sales job. 2 weeks later, at a family dinner, my father mentioned, in a different context, that he and my mother had helped Kyle with the deposit on the new place, $6,000, he said, almost bragging, but he's paying us back in installments, $20 a paycheck. $20 a paycheck on a $6,000 loan would take Kyle roughly 11 years to repay, assuming he never missed a single payment, which, given his history, seemed unlikely. I did the math in my head at the dinner table and said nothing, but I remember the specific, cold clarity of that moment, the first time I understood, consciously, that loan in my family was a word my parents used to make gifts to Kyle sound accountable, when in fact nothing about them was. I mentioned it to Daniel that night, in bed, in the dark, in the particular hushed voice you use when you're saying something out loud for the first time that you've been thinking for years. I don't think Kyle's ever paid them back for anything. Not really. I think it's all just theater. A performance of fairness that isn't actually fair. You've thought that for a while, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. I guess I have. What are you going to do about it? I didn't have an answer that night. But it was the first time anyone had asked me the question directly, and it lodged itself somewhere I couldn't shake for the next 2 years. Owen, and the cost of staying quiet. Owen was born when Sophie was 3, an easy, sunny baby who made our house feel, for the first time, genuinely full. Emma, 26 by then, had moved to Portland to be closer to her growing illustration career. She'd landed a contract doing children's book art, work that made my mother say, at every family gathering, some version of well, it's nice she found something that works out for her, in a tone that suggested she still considered it a hobby that had gotten lucky. Emma and I had grown close in those years, closer than we'd ever been as kids, partly because we were both, in our different ways, quietly extracting ourselves from the same gravitational pull. She came over most Sundays to see the kids, and it was on one of those Sundays, Owen asleep on her shoulder, Sophie building a block tower at her feet, that Emma told me something that changed the shape of everything that came after. Mom asked me for money last week, she said. Not alone. She asked if I'd consider gifting some of what I made off the last book advance toward Kyle's business. He's starting another thing. A gym franchise, I think, this time. What did you say? I said no. But Rachel, she paused, adjusting Owen against her shoulder, she got so cold. Like, genuinely cold. She said something like, I just think it's interesting that you can afford new furniture for your apartment but not to help your own brother. It wasn't even that much money, comparatively. It was like $1,000. But the way she said it made you feel like you owed it. Yeah. Emma looked at me, and something in her face was older than 26. Does she do that to you too? She's done it my whole life, I said, and saying it out loud, plainly, to someone who believed me instantly and completely, felt like setting down a bag I hadn't realized I'd been carrying with both hands for 2 decades. That conversation was, I think, the real beginning of everything that followed, not the discovery in the garage, which came later, but this quiet Sunday afternoon admission between two sisters who'd finally found the words for a pattern they'd both been living inside separately, believing, each of them, that they were the only one who saw it. Vivian's 90th, and the toast that told the truth. My grandmother turned 90 the spring Owen was 1, and my mother threw her a party at a banquet hall in Beaverton, 60 guests, a hired photographer, a slideshow of Vivian's life set to music, all of it, I noticed, organized and paid for almost entirely through the family trust my father still, technically, co-administered on my grandmother's behalf for tax purposes, though Vivian herself remained sharp enough to review every statement personally. Kyle gave the first toast, warm and rehearsed, the kind of toast that got easy applause. My mother gave the second, tearful and long, thanking Vivian for everything she'd sacrificed for this family, a phrase that would take on a very different meaning for me in a few months. Then my grandmother stood, at 90, refusing help from anyone, and gave her own toast, short, unsentimental, exactly like her. "I've had a long life," she said, "and I've learned exactly one thing worth repeating at a party. The people who tell you they love you the loudest aren't always the ones who show it the most carefully. Pay attention to who shows up quietly, consistently, without needing credit for it. Those are the ones worth your trust." She raised her glass, looked directly at me across the room, and added, to showing up quietly. Nobody but me seemed to notice where her eyes had landed. My mother clapped along with everyone else, already turning to fix a crooked centerpiece. 3 weeks later, my grandmother called me directly, not my mother, not Kyle, me, and asked if I would come by on a Tuesday afternoon, alone, to go over some papers. I told Daniel I'd be back by dinner. I had no idea I was walking into the conversation that would eventually unravel everything. The trust. My grandmother's kitchen smelled like it always had, coffee and the particular dry warmth of a house with the heat turned up too high for anyone but a 90-year-old. She had a folder waiting on the table, considerably thicker than the one I would later find in my parents' garage, and a legal pad covered in her small, precise handwriting. "Your grandfather set up an education trust in 1994, 6 months before he died," she said, without preamble, sliding the folder toward me. $15,000 each, for you, Kyle, and Emma, to be held and invested until you turned 18, then released for education expenses at the trustee's discretion until age 25, after which any remaining balance transfers outright to the beneficiary. Your father was named trustee. I was named successor trustee, in case anything happened to him. Okay, I said, not yet understanding why this mattered, why we were having this conversation now, at her kitchen table, in private. "I want you to look at the account statements," she said. "All the way back." I had Frank pull them. Frank was my Aunt Carol's husband, an accountant who'd done work for my grandmother for years. "I want you to look, and I want you to tell me what you see, because I've been staring at these numbers for 2 weeks and I need someone else's eyes on it before I do something about it." I opened the folder. It took me almost 40 minutes to go through everything, my grandmother sitting silently across from me the whole time, and by the end of it, my hands were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Kyle's account had been drawn down to almost nothing by the time he turned 20, $8,000 for the food truck, the rest slowly bled out in increments labeled, on my father's handwritten notes, things like Kay's transition support and family business bridge. Emma's account, smaller because she was younger when the drawdown started, showed similar patterns, though less severe, $4,000 pulled the year she turned 16, labeled simply family expenses. My account, the $15,000 that should have been sitting untouched, growing modestly in a money market fund for 9 years until I turned 18, showed a balance, the year I got my acceptance letter to Ashford, of $6,200. $31,000 had been withdrawn the previous fall, labeled, in my father's handwriting, K Restaurant Investment, Family Loan, Repayment Pending. There was no repayment. There had never been a repayment. And I understood, sitting at that table, exactly why my parents had called my full-ride scholarship a waste the year I turned 17, not because they were worried about homesickness or distance, but because Ashford's financial aid office required documentation of any existing education trusts before finalizing an award package, and my father knew, the moment I brought that acceptance letter to the dinner table, that any real scrutiny of Walter Hartley's education trust would reveal exactly what he'd already done with most of my share of it. They didn't want me to go, I said quietly, because they were afraid someone would look at the trust. My grandmother nodded slowly. That's what I think too. I didn't put it together until Frank found something else, going through the old records. She slid a second document across the table, a copy of a letter, dated the spring of my senior year, on Ashford University letterhead. This was addressed to your father. I don't know how he responded to it. But I know he never told you it existed. I read it twice before I could fully absorb it. It was from Dean Margaret Whitfield, the Dean of Financial Aid, requesting documentation of any existing custodial or trust accounts held in my name, as part of finalizing my Hartley Legacy Scholars Award, because the scholarship, funded partly through the university's endowment, required a standard financial disclosure for all named award recipients whose families had documented trust assets. The letter was polite, procedural, entirely routine. But at the bottom, in a handwritten note clearly added after the fact, Dean Whitfield had written something that made my chest go tight. Mr. Bishop, please note, if any discrepancy exists in reported trust assets, our office is happy to work confidentially with your family to resolve it before it affects Rachel's award status. We want this to be a positive experience for her. M.W. She knew, I said. Or she suspected. Sounds that way, my grandmother said. Frank thinks that's why your father pushed so hard for the deferral. Bought himself a year to figure out how to make the numbers work, or how to make the whole scholarship go away quietly instead of dealing with a dean who might ask harder questions. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after that, not crying, not yet. The crying would come later, alone, in my car, 3 streets from my own house, where I finally let myself feel the full weight of 17 years reorganizing themselves around a single new fact. My parents hadn't been worried about me. They had been worried about being caught. What do you want to do? My grandmother finally asked. I don't know yet, I said, honestly. But I want to see everything. All of it. Every statement, every letter, everything Frank found. That's the right first answer, she said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like someone in my family was fully, unconditionally on my side, asking for nothing back. The second letter. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage to call Ashford's financial aid office. Dean Whitfield had retired 11 years earlier, I learned, but the woman I spoke to, a records administrator named Patricia, was kind enough to pull my old file after I explained, carefully, that I was trying to understand some financial history from my time as a student. There's quite a bit here, Patricia said, sounding surprised. Dean Whitfield kept detailed notes on your file. That's not typical unless there was some ongoing concern. She mailed me copies of everything, 6 more letters beyond the one my grandmother had already shown me, spanning the 4 months between my initial acceptance and my eventual 1-year deferral, each one slightly more pointed than the last, each one addressed to my father, each one apparently never answered, based on the increasingly formal tone of each follow-up. The final letter, dated the June after my deferral was finalized, was different from the others. It was addressed not to my father, but to me directly, care of my parents' address, a letter I had never received, never opened, never known existed until Patricia mailed me a copy 17 years later. Dear Rachel, it read, I wanted to reach out personally, student to student, now that your enrollment has been confirmed for next fall. I've had the privilege of watching a few exceptional students navigate complicated family circumstances during my years in this office, and I want you to know that whatever discussions happened at home this year, they do not diminish what you earned. The Hartley Award exists because your grandfather believed education should outlast the person who pays for it. You did not take anything from anyone. You built something entirely your own. I look forward to meeting you on campus. Margaret Whitfield, Dean of Financial Aid. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I called Patricia back and asked her one more question. Had Dean Whitfield ever spoken with my parents directly, by phone, rather than just by letter? There's a note here, Patricia said, after a pause, dated the spring before your deferral. It just says, called Mr. Bishop directly trust documentation discrepancy. Advised family that any misuse of custodial education funds could affect both the student's award eligibility and potentially constitute a reportable issue depending on account structure. Mr. Bishop became defensive, ended call. Recommend continued monitoring of file. There it was. The moment referenced in the very title of the story I would eventually tell. The dean had called them personally. Not to scold me. Not to punish me. To warn my father, quietly, professionally, giving him every chance to fix what he'd done before it became something worse, and my father had hung up on her rather than answer a single honest question. I thanked Patricia, hung up the phone, and sat in my kitchen for a long time, Sophie's crayon drawings taped to the fridge behind me, Owen napping upstairs, and felt something settle in me that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some third thing, colder and more useful than either, clarity. Discovery. The garage. 3 weeks after my grandmother's death, she passed peacefully, in her sleep, the spring after her 90th birthday party, exactly the way she'd always said she wanted to go, quick, and on my own schedule, thank you very much. My mother asked me to help clear out the garage while the house was being prepped for sale. That was where I found the folder labeled Rachel, sitting behind a dishwasher manual, containing my father's own copies of the very letters Patricia had mailed me weeks earlier, plus something Patricia's file hadn't had, a handwritten ledger. In my father's careful engineer's printing, tracking every withdrawal from all 3 trust accounts across 9 years, with a final page, dated the same month I'd graduated from Ashford, that read simply, ours account never fully restored. Approximate 24,000 short of original growth. Discuss W. Diane Ree, how to handle when trust matures at 25. I was 25 the year that note was written. I had never heard a single word about the trust maturing, about any shortfall, about any plan to handle what they'd taken from me. The account had simply gone quiet, the way so many things in our family went quiet once they became inconvenient, and I had never known to ask. I stood in that garage for a long time, the folder in my hands, my mother somewhere inside the house humming along to the radio while she packed dishes, entirely unaware that I was, at that moment, 17 years of quiet clarity crystallizing into something I finally knew what to do with. I didn't confront her that day. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. My first instinct was not righteous fury. It was a kind of exhausted, methodical calm, the same calm I'd use, at work, when a major donor's pledge came back with a discrepancy in the paperwork. Something is wrong here. Don't react. Document. Verify. Then decide. I photographed every page of that folder with my phone before I put it back exactly where I'd found it, and I drove home that evening with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind already, quietly, beginning to build a case. Telling Emma. I told Emma first, over coffee at a shop near her apartment, sliding my phone across the table with the photographed pages pulled up. I watched her face change as she scrolled, confusion, then recognition, then something that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of finally having proof for a wound you'd spent years being told wasn't real. $4,000, she said quietly, finding her own account's entries. That's it. That's the number I've spent 10 years wondering if I imagined. You didn't imagine it. I know that now. She looked up at me, and her eyes were wet but her voice was steady. What are we going to do? I don't know yet. I want to talk to Priya first. And I think we need to talk to Kyle. Emma went quiet at that. You think he knew? I don't think he knew the full extent. I think he took what was offered without asking too many questions, because that's kind of always been his role in this family. But I don't think he orchestrated it. I think Mom and Dad did that, and Kyle just benefited from it without looking too closely. I paused. I could be wrong. That's part of what I want to find out. Emma reached across the table and took my hand, the same way our grandmother used to. I'm glad you found it, she said. I'm glad it was you. I don't think I would have had it in me to figure it all out like this. I would have just felt bad and let it go. You wouldn't have, I said. You would have found your own way. This is just how mine looks. Priya's office. Priya was a family law and estates attorney by then, 12 years into a practice in downtown Portland, and when I called her, I could hear the shift in her voice from friend to lawyer somewhere around the third sentence of my explanation. Okay, she said. First, I'm so sorry. Second, I need you to bring me everything. Every statement, every letter, every note, and I need you to stop talking to your parents about any of this until we've gone through it properly. Can you do that? I can do that. I spent the next week compiling everything, the photographed ledger pages, Frank's account statements going back to 1994, the letters from Dean Whitfield, bank wire records Frank had managed to piece together for the restaurant and the duplex flip, and a timeline I built myself, late at night after Daniel and the kids were asleep, cross-referencing every family event against every financial document until the whole shape of it sat in front of me on my dining room table, printed and organized into a binder with color-coded tabs, because that is simply how I process things that would otherwise swallow me whole. Priya went through the binder for 2 hours in her office, mostly silent, occasionally making a small sound that told me she'd found something significant. Legally, she said finally, closing the binder, this is messy. Custodial trusts like this one, especially informal family ones set up in the 90s without ironclad restrictions, give trustees a lot of discretionary leeway, enough that proving outright fraud, as opposed to poor judgment, would be genuinely difficult and honestly, expensive and painful for very little guaranteed payoff. Your father could argue, and probably would argue, that every withdrawal was intended as a loan, that he always meant to repay it, that he was acting within his discretion as trustee. So there's nothing I can do. I didn't say that. She leaned forward. Legally, going after your father for the money is an uphill fight I wouldn't recommend unless you're doing it purely on principle, which is a valid reason, but a costly one. But that's not actually what you're here for, is it? I sat with that question for a moment. No, I admitted. I don't think I want the money back. I mean, I want it acknowledged. I want them to admit what happened. But I don't think I'm trying to sue my father. Then here's what I'd actually suggest, Priya said. Your grandmother's estate is still in probate. You're a named beneficiary, and so is Emma, and so, notably, is Kyle, but with a stipulation I noticed in her will that I don't think you've fully clocked yet. Did you read the full document, or just the summary Frank sent around? I admitted I'd only skimmed it, still absorbing the garage discovery when the estate paperwork arrived. Priya slid a single page across her desk, a section of my grandmother's will I hadn't read closely. Your grandmother added an amendment 8 months before she died, around the time of her 90th birthday party, actually. There's a clause here directing the estate's executor, upon distribution, to first reconcile any outstanding balances in the Hartley Education Trusts against each grandchild's inheritance share, to ensure equitable treatment among all 3 grandchildren regardless of prior informal family arrangements. I read the clause twice. She knew, I said quietly. She knew, and she built in a correction. I think she did, Priya said. I think your grandmother spent the last year of her life quietly making sure that whatever your father had done, it would eventually come out into the light, on her terms, through her estate, without you having to be the one to drag it there. She just needed someone to actually go looking, and I think she was fairly confident that person would be you. I thought of her toast at the 90th birthday party, pay attention to who shows up quietly, consistently, and I understood, all at once, that my grandmother had been telling me something even then, in the last months of her life, in the only way she knew how to tell hard truths, sideways, at a party, in front of everyone, meant for exactly one person in the room. The decision. What I actually wanted. I want to be honest about the weeks that followed, because they were not clean or simple, no matter how calm I might have appeared from the outside. I went to therapy that month for the first time in my life. Dr. Lena Ostro, a quiet, unhurried woman my hospital foundation's employee assistance program connected me with, who spent our first 3 sessions doing almost nothing but asking me to describe, in detail, specific memories, without editorializing about what they meant. You keep using the word fine, she pointed out, in our 4th session. Everything in your childhood was fine. The scholarship comment was fine, I got over it. The trust withdrawals were fine, I understand why it happened. I want you to try something. I want you to tell me about the scholarship dinner again, but this time, don't tell me it was fine. Tell me what it actually felt like, in your body, sitting at that table. I did, haltingly at first, and by the end of it I was crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was 17 years old, alone in my childhood bedroom with a folded acceptance letter in my lap. It was the first time I had ever let myself fully feel the size of what had happened to me, rather than managing it, filing it, being fine about it. What do you actually want out of confronting them, if that's what you decide to do? Dr. Ostro asked, near the end of that session. Not what you think you should want. What do you actually want? I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I don't want the money, I finally said. I mean, I want it acknowledged, but I don't want to spend the next 2 years fighting my parents in court over $24,000. I want them to know that I know. I want them to stop being able to tell the story of my childhood as a story where they were the reasonable ones and I was the difficult, ungrateful daughter who left. I want the truth to exist somewhere outside my own head, where I can't be talked out of it anymore. That's not nothing, Dr. Ostro said. That's actually a very clear, very achievable goal. It's just not the goal most people expect themselves to have in a situation like this. I talked to Daniel that same week, late at night, after the kids were asleep, laying it all out for him the way I'd laid it out for Priya, the binder, the timeline, the letters, the ledger. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. I've watched your family do this to you for 10 years, he finally said. Slowly. Politely. In a way that never quite gave you anything solid enough to point to. I think part of why it's taken you this long isn't because you're not brave. It's because they made sure there was never anything solid enough to hold on to until now. He took my hand. Whatever you decide to do with this, I'm not going to tell you what the right choice is. But I want you to know you don't have to protect them from this. You've spent your whole life protecting people who never once protected you back. I talked to my boss, Barbara Chin, too, not about the specifics, but about the general shape of it, because Barbara had mentored me for 9 years and had, in her own quiet way, become one of the few older women in my life who reminded me of my grandmother. You raise money for a living by telling people the truth about what their gift will actually do, she told me. You're good at it because you don't dress things up. Don't start dressing this up now, just because it's your own family standing in front of you instead of a donor. I met with a financial advisor, Tom Alvarez, mostly out of practicality. If there was going to be a reckoning, I wanted to understand exactly what my own family's finances would look like once the trust was properly reconciled through the estate, so I wasn't walking into a conversation without a clear-eyed view of the numbers. By the end of that month, I had a decision, though it took shape more like a settling than a single dramatic moment. I wasn't going to sue my father. I wasn't going to demand repayment through the courts. But I was going to make sure the truth existed, plainly, in front of the entire family, at a moment when it could not be quietly managed away, and I was going to make sure that whatever inheritance came through my grandmother's estate was distributed exactly the way she'd intended, with the trust discrepancies properly reconciled, whether my father liked it or not. Preparation. Building the case, quietly. I spent the next 6 weeks doing what I do best, organizing. I built a complete timeline, cross-referenced against dates, ages, dollar amounts, and documents, until the entire 17-year arc sat in a single binder that Priya reviewed twice for accuracy. I met with Frank, my aunt's husband, twice more, and he walked me through the account statements line by line, helping me understand the exact mechanics of how $31,000 had moved out of my account and into Kyle's restaurant, disguised across 3 separate transfers spread over 5 weeks so as not to trigger a single large, conspicuous withdrawal on any one statement. I met with my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, who I hadn't confided in before, mostly because Carol had always struck me as fiercely, sometimes uncomfortably neutral in family matters, the designated peacemaker, the one who smoothed things over at every holiday. I was nervous, walking into her kitchen with the binder, that she'd simply defend my mother the way she always had. She didn't. She read through it slowly, at her kitchen table, and when she finished, she sat back and said, quietly, "I always wondered why your mother got so cagey whenever Mom brought up the trust. I thought it was just Mom being controlling in her old age. I didn't know it was this." She looked up at me. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I should have asked more questions over the years. I think a lot of us should have." I updated my own will and named a proper guardian for Sophie and Owen, a task I'd been putting off for years, because something about facing my parents' choices made me acutely aware of the choices I was making, or failing to make, for my own children. I changed the beneficiary designations on my retirement accounts, which had, embarrassingly, still listed my parents rather than Daniel, an oversight from before we were married that I'd simply never updated. I opened a separate savings account, just for Sophie and Owen's education, that no one but Daniel and I had any access to or knowledge of, and I funded it, that month, with the first of what would become regular contributions, a small, private promise to my children that no version of this story would ever repeat itself in their lives. I thought, more than once, about simply letting it go. About taking my portion of my grandmother's estate quietly, once probate resolved, and never bringing up the garage folder at all. It would have been easier, in the short term. It would also, I understood clearly now, have meant living the rest of my life inside a story my parents had authored about me, the sensitive one who left, who didn't understand family, who made everything so difficult, instead of the true story, which was that I had been quietly, systematically taken from for 17 years, and had said almost nothing about it, because I had been trained, since childhood, to believe that saying something would make me the problem. I decided the right moment to say something would be Thanksgiving. Not because I wanted a scene, I didn't, and I was determined there wouldn't be one, but because it was the one gathering, each year, where the entire family was reliably in one room, and because I wanted the truth to exist in front of everyone at once, so that no one version of events could quietly become the official one afterward. Kyle. I saw Kyle alone once before Thanksgiving, at his and Melissa's apartment, on a Tuesday evening while Daniel watched the kids at home. I hadn't told him why I was coming. He answered the door in sweatpants, mildly surprised, and Melissa made tea while the two of us sat at their small kitchen table. I didn't bring the binder. I'd decided, thinking it over carefully, that Kyle deserved a different conversation than the one I was planning to have with my parents, not an ambush, not evidence laid out like a courtroom exhibit, but an honest conversation between siblings, first. I found some old financial records from Grandma's estate stuff, I told him. About the education trust Grandpa set up for us. I wanted to talk to you before Thanksgiving, because some of it involves money that went toward your businesses over the years, and I didn't want you finding out about it secondhand, at a family dinner, in front of everyone. I watched Kyle's face carefully as I laid out the numbers, not accusingly, just factually, the way Priya had coached me. $31,000 from my account. $8,000 more before that. The $46,000 duplex loss. The restaurant's failure, and the money that had disappeared into it without ever coming back out. Kyle went very quiet, staring at his tea. I didn't know it was your money specifically, he finally said. I mean, I knew Dad helped me out, a lot, more than was probably reasonable. I told myself it was fine because it was family money, like some general pot everybody had access to when they needed it. I never thought about whose name was actually on it. He looked up at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something in Kyle's face that looked genuinely uncertain, rather than confidently, comfortably assured the way he always seemed to be. "That's messed up, Ratch. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that's not messed up. I'm not trying to make you pay me back," I said. "That's not why I'm here. I just needed you to know, before Thanksgiving, because I am going to talk about it with everyone, and I didn't want it to feel like an attack you didn't see coming." Melissa, who'd been quiet through most of this, finally spoke. "For what it's worth, Rachel, I've thought for years that something was off about how your parents talk about money in this family. Kyle's told me things that never quite added up. I always figured it wasn't my place to say anything." She glanced at Kyle. "I think it's past time somebody said something." Kyle didn't defend our parents that night, which surprised me more than almost anything else in the whole unraveling. He just sat with it, quietly, in a way that felt like the beginning of something, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the first real crack in 30 years of a story where he'd always, comfortably, been the center. "I'm glad you told me first," he said, as I was leaving. "I don't know what I'm going to say to Dad about it. But I'm glad it was you who told me, and not me finding out at the table like everybody else." The Hawaii photograph. A few days before Thanksgiving, sorting through old boxes at my own house to make room for a donated bookshelf, I found a photo album from the second of our 2 childhood trips to Hawaii, the one the summer I was 14, Kyle 18, Emma 9. I hadn't looked at it in years. I sat on my living room floor and paged through it slowly. There was a photo of the 5 of us on a beach in Maui, sunburned and squinting, my father's arms slung around Kyle's shoulders, my mother holding baby-faced Emma's hand, and me, off to the side slightly, holding a paperback novel I'd insisted on bringing to the beach because even at 14 I'd learned that being useful and quiet was safer than being anything else. I remembered, looking at it, that the trip had been paid for partly through a small distribution from the Children's Trust, a detail I hadn't understood at 14, had never questioned, and which I now recognized, with the clarity of everything I'd since learned, as another $2,000 quietly redirected from an account with my name on it toward a family vacation I had, at the time, been genuinely happy to go on. It wasn't a betrayal on the scale of the restaurant money. It was smaller, almost sweet in its ordinariness, a family trip, sunburns, a shared hotel room, real laughter that I remembered as real even now. But it told me something important, something I carried with me into Thanksgiving. The taking hadn't been one dramatic event. It had been woven thread by thread into the ordinary fabric of a childhood that had also, genuinely, contained happiness. Both things were true. My family had loved me, in their limited, complicated way, and they had also, consistently, taken from me without asking, and I no longer needed one truth to cancel out the other in order to finally say something about it. I put the album back in the box, carefully, and I kept the beach photo out, tucking it into my Thanksgiving binder, not as evidence, but as a reminder to myself that whatever happened at that table, I wasn't trying to destroy the family in that photograph. I was trying, finally, to tell it the truth. Confrontation. Thanksgiving. My parents hosted Thanksgiving every year in the same beige split level on Larkspur Street, and this year was no different on the surface. The same tablecloth, the same china behind the glass cabinet finally brought out for the occasion, the same rosemary potatoes, the same 22 years of holiday muscle memory playing out in the same rooms. 14 of us sat down that year, my parents, Kyle and Melissa and their 2 kids, Emma, Aunt Carol and Uncle Frank, Daniel and me and Sophie and Owen, and my mother's old friend from the neighborhood who'd been joining us for Thanksgiving since I was small enough not to remember a holiday without her. I'd brought the binder. It sat in a canvas bag by the front door the entire meal, and I said almost nothing about it through dinner itself, letting the ordinary rhythms of the holiday play out, Owen spilling cranberry sauce on the tablecloth, my father telling the same story about a fishing trip he told every year, Sophie asking, loudly, whether there was more pie. I waited until dessert, when the table had settled into that particular post-meal stillness, plates mostly cleared, coffee poured, the kids excused to the living room to watch a movie, Kyle glancing at me once, quietly, in a way that told me he'd been waiting all evening for whatever was coming. I want to talk about something, I said, and I want everyone to stay at the table for it, because I think it affects more of us than just me. My mother's smile flickered, just slightly. Can it wait until after dessert, sweetheart? It's dessert now, I said, gently but without backing down, and no, I don't think it can wait. I've been waiting 17 years already. I brought the binder to the table. I didn't raise my voice, not once, through the entire conversation that followed. I'd promised myself that going in, and I kept the promise, because I understood, with total clarity, that staying calm was the only way the truth would land as truth, rather than as one more emotional outburst my parents could quietly file away as an overreaction. I laid out the trust documents first, the original account statements, the ledger from the garage, the specific dollar amounts, the specific dates. I laid out Dean Whitfield's letters next, reading, aloud, the note Patricia had shown me, advised family that any misuse of custodial education funds could affect both the student's award eligibility and potentially constitute a reportable issue. Mr. Bishop became defensive, ended call. My father's face, through all of this, went through several stages, confusion, then something harder, then, briefly, something that looked almost like fear, before settling into a kind of stiff, wounded defensiveness that I recognized immediately from 20 years of watching him manage every difficult moment the same way. "You're twisting this," he said. Every dollar of that was intended to be repaid. That's how family loans work. You act like I stole something, and I was managing a trust for 3 children the best I could, under real financial pressure you never had to live through. "I'm not asking whether you meant to repay it," I said, still calm, still steady. "I believe you probably told yourself you would, at some point. I'm asking you to acknowledge, in front of this table, that when I brought home a full scholarship at 17 years old, a scholarship I earned entirely on my own, you and Mom called it a waste, and pushed me to defer for a year, because you knew a closer look at that trust would show exactly what had already happened to it. That's the part one need you to say out loud. Not the loans. Not the intentions. Just that the scholarship was never actually about distance, or homesickness, or my well-being. It was about what you were afraid the school would find." The table was completely silent. My mother had gone very pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and it was her, not my father, who finally spoke. "We were scared," she said quietly. "Gordon was scared, and I went along with it, because I always go along with it, and I have spent 17 years telling myself a version of that year where we were protecting you, because it was easier than admitting we'd already made a mistake we didn't know how to undo." Her voice cracked, slightly, on the last word. "I am not proud of that, Rachel. I have never been proud of that. I just didn't know how to say it out loud, and every year that went by, it got harder to say, because the longer you don't say something, the more it feels like saying it will destroy everything. It was, I think, the most honest sentence my mother had said to me in my entire adult life, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, hearing it, even as my father sat beside her, still rigid, still unwilling to meet my eyes. "I want to say the thing I actually came here to say," I told them, and this was the line I'd rehearsed, quietly, in my car, in the shower, in the last 5 minutes before every hard conversation of my adult life, the line that would become, eventually, the thesis of everything I'd learned. "You called my scholarship a waste because you were afraid of what it would cost you to be honest. But the only thing that scholarship ever wasted was 17 years I spent believing I had to earn a place in this family that should have been mine simply by being born into it." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Emma reached over and took my hand under the table, the same gesture I'd once used on her, all those Christmases ago, on the back porch with her sketchbook. Kyle, across the table, was crying, quietly, in a way I had genuinely never seen him cry before, not once in 38 years. "I don't want your money," I told my father, finally, directly. "I want Grandma's estate distributed exactly the way she specified in her will, with the trust discrepancies reconciled properly, the way she wanted. And I want you both to understand that I know now, fully, what happened, and that I am not going to spend the rest of my life pretending I don't, just so holidays stay comfortable." Consequences. The months after. Nobody threw a plate. Nobody stormed out. Thanksgiving ended that year with a stiff, subdued round of goodbyes, coats gathered quietly, my mother hugging me at the door a beat longer than usual, saying nothing, because there was, finally, nothing performative left to say. The estate finished probate 4 months later. Priya oversaw the reconciliation clause my grandmother had built in, and the numbers worked out almost exactly as Frank had projected. My share of the inheritance came in roughly $26,000 higher than Kyle's, and about $20,000 higher than Emma's, a correction, in writing, in a legally binding document, of exactly the imbalance my parents had spent 2 decades quietly creating and then quietly denying. My father did not apologize again, not directly, not in the months that followed. He grew quieter around me at family gatherings, fewer stories, fewer offhand comments about my choices, a kind of careful, watchful distance that I understood, eventually, as the closest thing to humility he was capable of. We are, as I write this, still not close. I don't know if we ever fully will be. But he stopped, entirely, making comments about my waste of a scholarship, or my impractical choice of husband, or any of the small, corrosive remarks that had shaped so much of my childhood, and for now, that quiet is its own kind of peace. My mother apologized more than once, in the months after Thanksgiving, real apologies, specific ones, not the vague, deflecting almost apologies I'd grown up hearing. She started therapy herself, at 61, something I never expected from her, and though our relationship remains careful, still finding its new shape, I believe, cautiously, that it is a relationship built now on something closer to honesty than the one I grew up inside. Kyle changed the most, in some ways, though it took him the longest to show it. He and Melissa sat down with a financial planner that spring, on their own initiative, and started, slowly, building an actual plan instead of waiting for the next rescue. He called me, 6 months after Thanksgiving, to tell me he and Melissa had started paying my parents back, in earnest, for some of what they could account for, not because anyone made him, he said, but because I don't want my kids growing up thinking this is just how family works. It was, I think, the most mature sentence I ever heard my brother say. Emma's relationship with our mother remains the most strained of anyone's. She has kept firm boundaries, limiting visits, declining to discuss finances at all, insisting, gently but consistently, on being treated as an adult whose art was a career and not a hobby. Our mother, to her credit, has mostly respected those boundaries, even when I can tell it costs her something to do it. 3 years later. It has been 3 years since that Thanksgiving. Sophie is 11 now, sharp and funny and unbothered by things that would have flattened me at her age, and Owen is 8, still sunny, still easy, a different kind of childhood than mine in almost every visible way. We still go to my parents' house for holidays, though less often than we used to, and always on terms Daniel and I set clearly in advance. My father has, slowly, become a different kind of grandfather than he was a father, more patient with Sophie and Owen than I remember him ever being with the three of us, which I've come to understand, through years of therapy, as its own complicated kind of grief, watching someone finally offer freely, to the next generation, what you spent your own childhood earning through performance. Emma had her first gallery show last spring, a series of portraits she'd been quietly working on for 2 years, and I stood in front of one of them for a long time, a portrait of our grandmother, in her 80s, at the kitchen table where she'd once slid a folder of trust documents across to me and asked me to look. The placard beside it read simply, "For showing up quietly." Kyle and Melissa bought a modest house last year, financed conventionally, on their own credit, no family bridge loan attached to it, and at the small housing warming they hosted, Kyle pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, "I know I don't say this enough, but Thanksgiving, 3 years ago, that was the best thing that ever happened to this family, even though it didn't feel like it at the time. I needed somebody to finally stop letting me get away with it." My mother and I have coffee once a month now, just the two of us, a ritual we started tentatively about a year after Thanksgiving and have kept, carefully, ever since. She still occasionally slides toward an old pattern, a comment about appearances, a flicker of the old managerial tone, and I have learned, finally, how to name it gently when she does, without either of us needing the conversation to become a crisis. She thanked me last month, unprompted, over coffee, for not giving up on this family, even when we made it so hard to want to. I think about my grandmother often. I think about the check she pressed into my hand at graduation, the note that said, "This is not a handout, this is interest on what's already yours." I understand, now, in a way I couldn't at 22, exactly what she meant, that some of what we're owed in this life isn't money, and isn't even an apology, but simply the truth, spoken plainly, by the people who owe it to us, at last. Final reflection. I still work at the Children's Hospital Foundation. I still spend my days asking people to be honest about what they can give, and helping them understand that generosity, real generosity, isn't about appearances, it's about showing up quietly, consistently, for people who need it, without needing credit for it. I think, sometimes, about that dinner table on Larkspur Street, 17 years old, an acceptance letter shaking slightly in my hands, and the sentence that shaped so much of my life afterward, "We just think this scholarship is going to end up being a waste." They were wrong about the scholarship. But they were right, in a way none of us understood at the time, that something in our family was about to be wasted, not my education, not my potential, but 17 years of a relationship that could have been honest so much sooner, if anyone at that table had been brave enough to simply tell the truth. I said it plainly that Thanksgiving, and I'll say it now, one more time, because it is the truest thing I know. You called my scholarship a waste because you were afraid of what it would cost you to be honest. But the only thing that scholarship ever wasted was 17 years I spent believing I had to earn a place in this family that should have been mine simply by being born into it. I don't believe that anymore. And that, more than any inheritance, more than any apology, is the thing I actually walked away with. Thank you so much for staying with me through this one. If you made it all the way to the end, I'd genuinely love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know what part hit hardest, or if this reminded you of your own family in any way. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, because I share a new story like this every week, and this community, honestly, has become one of the most meaningful parts of my own life. And if you have a story of your own, about family, about money, about the moment you finally told the truth out loud, I'd be honored if you shared it below. We're all just trying to figure out how to show up quietly, consistently, for the people who deserve it. Thanks for showing up here today. I'll see you in the next one.